Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with Inflection Point Podcast.
Well, hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this is the 2023 finale episode of Inflection Point Podcast, where we are dedicated to the art of listening in authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of understanding, self-awareness, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. So I am your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hello, I'm Mavis Bauman. Happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and yes, happy holidays to everyone. And thank you.
Yes, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Kwanzaa, all that stuff. Yeah, all that good stuff. And I'm really excited that we've made it through like our second full year of Inflection Point Podcast. The fires are still going because we've already decided on what our theme is going to be in 2024. And we've actually started a little bit of moving in the direction of that theme, which is community conversations. And we started that by looking at authors who sparked community conversation. And this is actually part 2 of that conversation featuring the work of Robert P. Jones, PhD. He is the president and founder of the Public Religious Research Institute. He serves on the National Program Committee for the American Academy of Religion and writes a weekly newsletter dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity, I should say. In the previous episode, we looked at his book, Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, Mapping the Doctrine of Discovery. So we kind of started that conversation about the Doctrine of Discovery and that the genealogy of modern racism and its connection to the Doctrine of Discovery, which is the international law of colonialism. And so the book is also about reframing American origins to explain how the United States built this philosophical framework for a democratic society that is built on a foundation of mass racial violence. And so the book that we talked about in part 1 was sort of a focus on some of those types of topics. And today we are going to be looking at another one of his books. It's called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And one of the way I kind of look at this body of work, it's sort of this story of the land, the need for labor, which ultimately showed up in the form of slavery, and the role that Christianity actually played in all of that. And so that's what this second book is really taking a look at that, and but really honing in on the space of white supremacy and its existence in American Christianity. So here's actually a quote from the book. It's nothing short of astonishing that a religious tradition with this relentless emphasis on salvation and one so hyper attuned to personal sin can simultaneously maintain such blindness to the social sins swirling about it, such as slavery, and race-based segregation and bigotry, close quote. And so I look at that, the words in that, and those words are so incredibly powerful. And it's lifting up that veil. We've talked about this idea of lifting up the veil, or when you that old expression of just sweeping everything under the carpet, under the rug, but then you just end up with a dirty, lumpy rug. So when you pull back that rug, that's when you can see all the dirt and the filth that's there. And that's what he is doing in connecting, in this work, connecting the issue of the land and colonialism, right? Distilling the exploitation, the dispossession of the land from the indigenous people, the need for the labor to work the land, and the introduction of slavery as a method for working the land with free labor. So just kind of thinking about that economic story that is being told, this whole idea of it, the exploitation of labor, and to the point where that labor is free. People are forced into a servitude and all of that. But I think the really telling part of that story is the fact that Christianity plays such a prominent role in maintaining that system of dispossessing the land, the labor, exploitation of labor, slavery, that Christianity actually played a role in that, but we're looking at it from the lens of an adulterated Christianity, if you will. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of that, but just thinking about this idea of the doctrine of discovery, which is the international law of colonialism. And what that means is colonialism was this thing that was established very purposefully, right, to serve specific purposes related to economics and wealth and all of that. So just going to read you a couple of things that are connected with this doctrine of discovery, the international law of colonialism, and then thinking about it also in the fact that this is the international law. So this is not something that just existed in the United States. It didn't just exist in Britain. This was the international law of colonialism. And there's three major points that I wanted to kind of make here on this topic. And the first is the idea and the belief that is ingrained in this international law of colonialism, the idea that God designated America as a new promised land, shaping how 5 centuries of Europeans would understand the new world and the people who populated it. So it's really setting up the stage. It's setting up the stage for how these European countries are going to interact with the land in this whole idea of colonialism. And it set the standard, if you will. That's point number one. Point number two is this idea of having the right to go in to kill, steal, destroy, conquer, and reduce the persons that are already there into this state of perpetual slavery. And so the first step of that is take the land, right? So when you take the land, you have to do something with the people that are there possessing the land, right? And so you look at that whole aspect and how that was unfolding when you connect that to different aspects related to Native American history, as an example, and how that all ties in, Indian boarding schools and all of that, how it was all designed to just genocide, stealing land, and all of that. But it was sanctioned by this doctrine of discovery, right? Which people got together and decided that this is what the doctrine of in our international law of colonialism is going to be. And we are going to implement this, and we're going to go by this institution that we're setting up, okay? And then the third point is what I was mentioning earlier, this interconnection between the land, labor, slavery, economics, and Christianity, right? And so when you think about the enslavement of Africans, it was the perpetuation and the continuation of genocide and the dispossession of the land flowing from the first European contact with North American indigenous people, right? And so it's looking at all of this through this different lens that we have not traditionally been taught to look at through this kind of lens. We just got through Thanksgiving just a few weeks ago, so we all know what we were taught about this idea of Thanksgiving, the very first Thanksgiving, and all of the love and the sharing, and they were taught how to grow the corn, and all of these different pieces of this fairy tale that we were fed as children. And now we're living in this space and time when we need to tell the truth, right? We just need to tell the truth. So Mavis or Gail, any comments on that? And then I'm actually going to pass the baton to Mavis, and she's going to talk about some of those legal dimensions of the doctrine of discovery. But some of the things that I just talked about and brought up, any comments, questions?
Do you want to go first, Gail, and then I'll lead my questions into my next section? That might work.
We talked about this a little bit last time, but when Columbus actually came the first time, they went back and asked the Pope to write a doctrine that stated that unless that group of people were Christian, according to what they were writing as Christian, that not necessarily Christ's teachings, but Christian, that they were people that were less than and could be then enslaved forever. And so they came into a country before they even brought the slaves over, because slave trading had already existed at that point, even in the 1600s in Europe. But they first had to invade this land, and that was already occupied by millions of people that had lived here for however long before they ever came. And so I want everybody just to have that perspective of that this God-given right to this land was not exactly from God. And the messages that we can talk about later around how they justified their genocide and slavery forever, and even including the slave Bible, which we'll talk about, was just a lie. I mean, it was all based on outward manipulation in order to achieve what their goal was, which was the development of the land and economics.
Exactly. Thank you. So Mavis?
Well, a couple of questions have been coming up as I look at this. One is, and I didn't get time to research this, but my memory is that indigenous peoples did not own land. They had territories that they moved through, but the land belonged to nature. Am I wrong on that? I don't know. But anyway, it wasn't something that they necessarily had legally title to sell. So then, when the Europeans came in, they said, hey, I want that. So then it reminds me, Anita, of how you said the laws are written by those in power. So the laws were written in a way that enabled the Europeans to, quote unquote, legally transfer the land to themselves, it sounds like. Mm-hmm. Another question I had is, did they not have enough land at that time? Were they falling off the edges into the ocean? Or was it just adventurous discovery, and Columbus said, hey, let's take this. And how can I make it okay?
Yeah, so I take issue with looking at it as adventurous discovery, because that's how it's depicted, that, these explorers, and they were wonderful, and they were finding this land, and they were working the land, and blah, 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 all of that. But the underbelly of that story is the fact that there were people living here. And I think the first point that you brought up is recognizing the fact that indigenous people didn't necessarily look at the land as something that you own. It's something that you take care of. It's something that you're a part of. So this idea of purchasing land wasn't necessarily in their purview. The Europeans brought that idea with them, right? But at the same time, they were displacing people. If you think about the Trail of Tears, how they forced people out and out of spaces that they had lived in for generations, and all of a sudden you're forced out west. And so if you had those individuals who were more in the southern states, as an example, where it's warmer, and now they're being forced into colder climates, and a lot of people died on the Trail of Tears, right? And so I think it's this idea that you're taking one philosophy of life and forcing it, imposing it on people who already live there. That's the same story in Africa, colonization in Africa. There are people living here. I look at it like this. In my home, this is my home where I live. Who has the right to just come in, take my home, remove me from my home, throw me on the street, or kill me, remove all of my possessions, get rid of my possession, and move into my home as if they have a God-given right to that? And they do not.
No, they do not.
They do not. Anymore.
I didn't mean to imply that.
No, I know you didn't. But for our audience sake, I wanted to kind of explain that just a little bit, because what you had was this conflicting view of how do you utilize the land, or how do you exploit the land? Because a lot of this capitalistic way of thinking also exploits the land, whereas indigenous people respect the land.
Right, exactly.
Because they get their sustenance comes from the land. So it's a whole different idea. It's like the Ubuntu principle in South Africa. You know, we learned about the Ubuntu principle. It's that kind of thing, but the Europeans don't have that. They didn't have that. You know, so it's different in that regard. So maybe I'm going to let you slide into that you wanted to talk about.
I'm going to talk about kind of the 5 key principles, legal principles within the doctrine of discovery. And I might read just a little bit of them and then put it in Dick and Jane terms for myself. But the first one is called first discovery. And that is that the first European country to discover lands unknown to other Europeans claimed that property and sovereign rights. So that's basically what you just described. Somebody came into your house and said, you got to go, you're my slave now, I get all your house, your land, your everything, which is incredible. At that point, though, it was considered incomplete title. So this is where the laws come in. You know, the laws are written to reinforce it. The second principle is actual occupancy and current possession. So to turn first discovery into recognized title, a European country had to actually occupy and possess newly found lands. This was done by building forts and settlements. And, you know, it's kind of like finding a parking space. Hey, I was here first, it's mine, you know? It's just mine. Now I have title to it. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. Okay, and then the other couple of ones you wanted me to highlight was Christianity. Religion was a significant aspect of the doctrine of discovery. Under discovery, non-Christian peoples were not deemed to have the same rights to land, sovereignty, and self-determination as Christians. Now, I grew up in a Christian church, and I was certainly never taught about this concept. This is a big lump under the rug that, you know, we think that we are, like you say, have God-given rights to just go to claim, steal, kill, and possess something. By virtue of our religion. Now, wasn't that in the papal bull you talked about last week, Gail, or last time?
Yes.
Yeah. So the Pope set us up for that. And then another principle or legal principle is civilization. So when we're talking about civilization here is the European ideals of civilization that were important parts of discovery and ideas of superiority. So the Europeans themselves defined what was civilized. When really, when we look back into history and artifacts and everything, the indigenous culture here in this country had a perfectly functioning civilization where they worked with the land, they minded their own territories. I'm sure there were conflicts and things, but it was a civilized, perhaps more than anything that we have going on today. Europeans thought that God had directed them to bring civilized ways and education and religion to indigenous peoples and to exercise paternalism and guardianship powers over them. That word paternalism just, gives me shivers down my spine, because it implies that people who were living here originally weren't as fully developed or as genius, as we would say, as any other human being. And so they were treated in a way like children. So then the last one I'm going to highlight here is conquest. Conquest, this element claimed, in quotes, that Europeans could acquire Indian title by military victories in just and necessary wars. In addition, conquest was also used as a term of art to describe the property rights Europeans claimed to have acquired automatically over indigenous nations by just showing up and making a first discovery. So those are pretty heavy duty. And they, like I say, I grew up in the Christian church, and it's making me challenge a lot about what I was taught, about how I was taught to think about others, and so on. In one of the podcasts, Robert P. Jones, whom I think is just awesome, he talks about this little stamp. He used to be a stamp collector, and on that stamp was a picture of the founding fathers signing, the documents. And he says, we need to zoom out on that image. What was really there? What was really happening at that time? We've carved out this little white piece of history and imbued it with power. And so I love the way he's looking at that. So I have some other comments I may bring up later about how he's approaching this whole subject. So those are my points on the doctrine of discovery. Anybody want to ask me any questions on those or add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you talked about with the actual occupancy and current possession, because one other aspect of it was this physical possession. So it wasn't enough just to go there and stick a stake in the ground and say, this is my land. That physical possession had to be there. And if that physical possession had to be there, and it had to be accomplished within a reasonable amount of time after the first discovery in order to create that complete land title. So when you come to this land and you're taking this physical possession, what do you do with the people who are already there?
What did they do?
And that is the essence of what we're talking about.
Right.
What you did to the people who were already there. And one of the things that you talked about is what you were taught when you were growing up, because a lot of this stuff was very similar. We all went to American public schools and all of that. We were all taught the same history.
Right.
But when you lived in a different type of household, so a lot of Black kids, when we lived in our Black experience at home, we got the history aspect. And so it's not just about what we were taught from that public education perspective, but it's also about what we weren't taught.
Yes.
We weren't taught the truth. We were taught the gloss over, make it look good, support the idea of white superiority. We were taught that.
Yeah.
But that's
supported by God. And have it supported by God.
Supported by
exactly.
God. Right.
Exactly.
Mhm.
You know, even when I was growing up in the Lutheran Church, there was this sort of consternation between Catholics and Lutherans.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody very close to me in his catechism class was taught that if he was in a boat and there was a Catholic in the water and a Lutheran, who should you save? And he was taught, you have to save the Lutheran.
Save the Lutheran. Yep.
And that broke him for the rest of his life in terms of his growing faith, because that made no sense to a young kid. But there was, even within the Christian world, there's a hierarchy of who's better, who's right, who's wrong. And
exactly.
Yeah, talk about stuff under the rug.
And those things that are wrong, in so many instances, it's about who's superior to who.
Yes, exactly.
Who's more important to who, which completely violates the parable of the Good Samaritan and the point that Jesus was trying to make. When you understand the division that was there between the Jewish people in that time period and the Samaritans, he deliberately chose a Samaritan to be the hero of the story, because they were the group that were outcast, and they were the group that were hated. They were like the Black people, if you will.
Right.
And so that division was there. And also when he talks in the Bible, who's your neighbor? Who is your neighbor? That was part of that Samaritan story. Who is your neighbor? The guy that did good. That's your neighbor. And then when you connect that to the greatest commandment, right? Love God with everything you got. Love your neighbor as yourself. So when you're looking in that ocean and you see the Lutheran and the Catholic, which one do you consider to be the one that you should love according to Christ? And so if you're looking at it from the Christ perspective, you're going to try to see both.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I love the idea of, and Robert Jones used this analogy too, opening the aperture. What else is in the scene? And looking deeper and broader. It's not to negate some of the good things that we have been able to do. You know, it's not that, but it's to get the full picture of history in order to inform the future.
Right. Absolutely.
To live together in a different way, which I think is really exciting. That there's even that concept.
Right. Gail, did you have any final comments? Then we're going to go to break.
No, I'm good right now.
Oh, you're good? Okay. I did have one other comment. Something else that jumped out at me on the conquest part. I think it's interesting when the military victories are defined as just and necessary wars, but they're being defined by the people who are stealing the land.
Exactly.
So of course you're going to define it within the context that puts you in that superior position, which is essentially, we're just going to come in, take your land, move you out of the way, and oh well.
And kind of faultless, right? I'm just
exactly. We're not at fault here because this is God's sanction.
Yeah.
And that's where the Christianity piece comes in. And so we're going to take a break now, and then we're going to come back, and Gail's actually going to lead us in a discussion of the Christianity piece of all of this. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast and our book discussion of White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, written by Dr. Robert P. Jones, president and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute. And I am going to pass the baton over to Gail, and she's going to lead us in a discussion of this really important aspect of Christianity and the role that it played in all of this discussion that we're having.
Okay. So Christianity, and I have to clarify saying it's not what Christ necessarily taught, but what Christianity was at that point in time in history, right? So religion was a significant aspect of the doctrine, obviously we talked about, of discovery, and non-Christian people were not deemed to have the same rights to any land or sovereignty and self-determination as quote Christians were. And the belief requires adulteration of the word of God, and it does. So a missionary, and I had never known about the slave, I never heard about the slave Bible until I started doing this podcast. But a missionary book published in London in 1807 on behalf of the Society for the Conversion of Negro Slaves. The quote from the slave Bible says, "Let the story be told, a unique artifact in focus exhibition presented by the museum." This is presented by the Museum of the Bible in DC. The slave Bible contained only select parts of the biblical text. Its publishers deliberately removed portions of the biblical text, such as the Exodus story, that could inspire hope for liberation. Instead, the publishers emphasized portions that justified and fortified the system of slavery that was so vital to the British Empire. And even after the war, the United States declared itself independent, it continued to be so vital to maintaining slavery. So this is a Bible that parts were taken out of and parts were rewritten. The whole story about Noah and his sons, especially Ham, they rewrote that to make it seem as if Ham was African or black, and that he was this horrible being, and also connected to Islam, that therefore he should never be permitted to own land, to be free, to be treated with anything of equality. They left out a quote in the Bible that from Jesus that actually says that all of us in the eyes of Jesus are the same.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't put that in. They also didn't put in Abraham and how he was helping his people rebel and become free, because he didn't want anybody that was a slave to get any ideas that maybe they could also do that. So the whole slave Bible was actually given to the slaves to read, to convince them of why they were slaves. I mean, it's like gaslighting 1010. I mean, it's over and over again. It's just all in the name of God, all in the name of Christ. And that's what's so upsetting. I mean, that they were just manipulating whatever they could because they feared that the slaves would get together and they would say, enough of this. We're going to become free. And that's exactly what eventually happened. But this Bible came out around the time when they started feeling and hearing those rumbles occurring, right? Mm-hmm. And so they used it as a way of intimidating and managing and controlling the mass population of slaves,
mm-hmm.
and from ever getting free.
What did you say when the drum rolls started occurring? I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you were saying.
When I say drum rolls, I'm not sure what you were.
But there was something that caused a change in what was happening, and they decided that they wanted to be free.
Well, I think in the early 1800s, there were people that were the black people were starting to say, enough, right? I want to be free too. This isn't right. And
maybe
right.
There was enough conversations that I'm sure that the plantation owners and people started becoming aware of. So that was how many years before the Civil War.
Yeah, I want to interrupt here because the notion of freedom was always there in the African slaves.
Right.
It was always there.
Always wanted it.
It was always there.
They always wanted
it. If you think about the Amistad ship.
Oh,
right.
I need to watch that again.
Yeah, and there's that one scene in that movie that I think is one of the most powerful scenes in the movie, and it's when they're in the courtroom. And the attorney representing the African, which was Matthew McConaughey, yeah, that guy, and he was presenting his argument, and the gentleman who was the African leader stands up and said, "Give us free." I will never forget that statement and him standing up in the middle of that courtroom, because they couldn't even speak English, but they understood after listening to them what it meant to be free. We want freedom. So the idea that freedom had to come about, they came here with the desire to be free. And there's also, when you think about the slaves who would rather have died and threw themselves overboard than to be in the, they had no idea where they were going. But this idea of being free, I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
I don't want to be here. So I think we have to be careful that we don't somehow present, and I know that's not what you're doing.
No.
I know that. But I want to be careful that I'm not somehow presenting this idea that there was like this complacency or something among the Africans. They were always fighting for freedom.
Yeah.
They were always fighting for freedom, all the way up until today. We're still fighting for freedom.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, so that is something that was ingrained in them by virtue of the fact that they were snatched from their homes
Right.
and put onto a ship going to God knows where. So that desire for freedom was always there.
This has just got the attention of slave owners, are the people that were realizing.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
You can't take anybody from their native country and where they live free and take them to another country and enslave them and expect them not to desire their freedom. I can't imagine any human being not wanting to desire their freedom.
Not one.
Right. Exactly.
just
Exactly. And so the hope was,
Right.
as the, you know, as the Africans are here, and you had, you know, because there was a point where the transatlantic slave trade stopped.
Right.
And so that's when they switched to breeding. So now the idea is now, you know, that they're here, they're breeding and all of that. And now we have more and more babies that are being born into this system of slavery. And then it makes it easier in that instance to be able to control, do this mind control thing and tell them that this is what you were put on the planet for. But when you think about it, using the Bible became one of their weapons. It just became a weapon for them to keep people in a prescribed position. This is where I need you to be in order for me to reap the benefit, the economic benefits of this land and what this land can produce. I need for these people to stay in this position. And so, but when their human spirit starts to rise up, Harriet Tubman and so many others, rebellion, Nat Turner, all of that rebellion, why would that rebellion not be there?
That's right.
You see? And then all of the violence, now you got to start putting all these laws in place. You got to start doing this. You got to have guns. Negroes can't have guns. They can't have this. They can't have that. All because you know, number one, you know what you're doing is wrong on some level, and you're as a human being, you know this is wrong. And then there's also the fear aspect, because that desire to be free can be so strong. You're just going to have to take me out because I'm trying to get away from here. And so when you think about all of that type of emotion that's going on, and you're using the word of God to try to keep that swell from growing, right? And you keep using the word of God more and more and more to keep people in their place. But now you start having slaves who are actually starting to read, and they're starting to get their hands on the real Bible, not the slave Bible. And they're starting to see the Exodus story. They're starting to see these people who were enslaved and God brought them out of slavery.
Well, they're starting to read Christ's actual teachings that, right? And so of course, that was just going to fuel their desire.
Absolutely.
The fear of the slave owners. And as their fear increased, they started pulling out more and more horrific reasons and ways of controlling them. Even after the Civil War, think about all the black laws and so forth that happened.
Right. Exactly.
They justified being able to put somebody in prison by talking to somebody on the street corner. I mean, just absolutely ridiculous. They're always trying to make sure they found different ways to intimidate and to put somebody that was not white into a place that was far beneath them. Because they didn't want to lose that free labor. And they didn't want to lose that position that they created falsely.
And then there's the intimidation and the horror and the beating down.
Absolutely.
Robert Jones uses this word. I really like it, and he does too. But he talks about the rapaciousness of the colonialists, that they are given to seizing for plunder or the satisfaction of greed. What kind of goal is that, right? Rapacious, yeah. Wow. That's quite a motivation.
In some ways.
You know, and then, you know, adulterating the word of God, as you say, Anita, to justify horrible behavior. Yeah.
Yeah. So
I was just a few days ago, I heard, excuse me, Anita, this is quick.
no worries.
In some context related to Israel and Gaza right now, someone said, war doesn't solve anything. And I thought, who originally said that? So I was Googling it, found this poet, Francis Dugan, said that, you know, he talks about just war just causes destruction. I lost the link here. But anyway, just to think about that, what have you gained really? You are living on the blood of the people that you killed.
Right. Well, look at what Putin has done in Russia. I mean, not to get too political here.
Exactly.
Thing. He's
Yeah,
destroying. He wants to claim this country as Russian, and yet he's destroying it. He doesn't care whether he destroys people or buildings.
Yeah. And doesn't think that that's going to come back and bite you.
We are
What
not learning.
Solved. Yeah.
As humanity, we are needing to learn.
Yeah.
Remember what is true.
Yeah, when I was working on my master's degree, I have a master's in education. When I was working on that, I made a decision that in the groups of people that I wanted to study, I didn't just want to focus on African Americans and the impact of, you know, what happened to the Native Americans, how that impacted the enslaved people and all of that. I decided that I really wanted to focus on the indigenous people. And one of the things that really stood out for me is this idea of cultural genocide and this idea of dismantling a culture and desocializing the people, right? And so I wrote a paper on the Native American education and cultural dissonance. And this quote, I was looking at that paper recently, and this quote really jumped out at me. Since first contact, Native Americans have been given three choices: assimilation, relocation, and genocide, which really were not choices at all. The first choice was for a tribe to willingly assimilate into the dominant American culture, becoming civilized, giving up their tribal ways, and being absorbed into American society. And eventually, education became a tool for forced assimilation. And I emphasize the word forced assimilation into the Indian boarding school experience. And the government's push to assimilate Native tribes continued through the 1950s.
Right.
Just let that sink in. Continued through the 1950s. And you think about the different challenges that indigenous people in the lands that have been set aside as sovereign lands, the issues that they still deal with, living and surrounded by these capitalistic forces, and there are still people, organizations trying to take land from them in 2023. I mean, just let that sink in. Right. And then there was a seminar at the Howard Divinity School at the Theological Library, and the title of that exhibit was Slavery Alongside Christianity. And this was one of the quotes from one of the students. The relationship between Christianity and slavery was not an easy one and affected more than just the church. This debate carried over to politics and economic issues that really were an inspiration for the whole Civil War. I think it's important to realize the impact and importance of religion and how religious disagreements lead to broader disagreements in a whole political climate. Think about where we are now.
That's where we are.
Exactly where we are.
The remnants of that are still there,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Or they're actually growing in a way.
Right.
You know,
We're
they're
not
increasing.
Yeah. And that polarization is there,
Mhm.
right? The same way the country was polarized with the cessation of the Confederate States when they seceded from the Union. That polarization was there, and we're still experiencing polarization today. And the root of the polarization that we're experiencing today is the same root of the state seceding from the Union. It's the same
The
root.
colonialists and
The colonialism and all of the things that were laid down, the foundations that were laid down in the colonial era, and those things are still carrying over into today.
Mhm.
it's amazing.
So what's carried over is really the white supremacy.
Yeah,
And that-
exactly.
right?
I was gonna say,
Exactly.
yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. This whole notion of white supremacy. So I want to shift a little bit because we're almost out of town. So this idea, I think I said we're almost out of town. I meant to say we're almost out of time. So from Columbus Day to Black History Month to Indigenous Peoples Day, right? And so there's a movement now to moving away from the whole celebration of Christopher Columbus. And now we have, Black history. We've been celebrating Black history for quite a while. Now we're kind of moving into this space of celebrating the indigenous people, recognizing the significance and a need for a broader understanding of American history that includes the contributions and the perspectives of indigenous people as well as African Americans, right? So there was an article that was written by Becky Little, talking about the Indigenous Day celebrations and the history and the contributions. And that Indigenous Day has been recognized since 2021. So the question was, why replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day? Columbus Day represents, so there's 2 points. Columbus Day represents the violent history of colonization in the Western Hemisphere, right? Mm-hmm. And the second point is focusing on Native American history. Virtually none of my universities, so this is a university professor who is asking this question or making this statement. Virtually none of my university students has had any education whatsoever in the history of this country's treatment of the 10 million or so people who lived here before the Europeans arrived.
10 million.
So this quote was in 2015. And she's talking about students that are currently in colleges now that have no idea of this history.
Mm-hmm. I mean, 10 million people lived here. 10 million.
Oh, and that quote was from Sharon Speed. She's a UCL. She's a professor of American Studies at UCLA.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's just so much. There's so much.
So much.
Just swept under the rug, and just the rug is getting dirtier and dirtier and bulkier.
Lumpier. You know,
we can repair it.
In that
uncover the truth.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Gail.
The only way we can repair that is that's not even possible, but it's to be, at least to clarify what the truth is.
Yep.
Right. In fact, that relates to what I was going to say. This fellow that interviewed Robert Jones in a podcast was thanking Jones about, opening up the aperture and to reveal white supremacy, and not to try to fix the past, but to address it, as I was saying, something similar, for our future. We are only at the beginning of telling the truth.
Right.
And, somebody like Jones, and I mean, we've come across a lot of people who've been talking that way. This is exciting. This is a good thing. This is not, open your wallet, and that'll solve everything. This
Exactly.
is not about that.
Exactly.
You know, I also remember that interview that Martin Luther King did in that church, and he was talking about how parcels of land, you know, of course, originally were given to former slaves and then taken back. And then they were given out to white Americans, and an organization called County, I'll come up with it in a minute, but they helped white farmers learn how to farm.
Oh, they
My
taught-
former husband's parents were both homesteaders. So
Mhm.
they were given pieces of land, maybe a small fee, but they had to work it. Just, I mean, this was in my lifetime.
Mhm.
My lifetime.
Exactly.
County
Exactly.
Extension, that's what it was called. County Extension. Makes no
Mhm.
sense to me, but anyway, yeah, these people were there to help the white people learn how to farm when the African Americans had been farming since the moment they got here, working.
Right.
They were farming before they got here, and that's why they were.
Excuse me, of
Right.
course,
Exactly.
they
Exactly.
were farming forever.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
that's
And
what-
so you connect all of this to redlining.
right.
Same thing.
Yeah,
Same thing.
Mm.
Where does development happen? The development doesn't happen in the red line districts. It happens in the green line districts.
right.
It's the same conversation. It's the same
Yeah.
soup worn
Exactly.
over century after century after century
Right.
after century.
That's
But I
right.
think now we're in a different place now because so much is being revealed. So much is being talked about. Right.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. This is not just write a check. This is to sit down and have a conversation and eat a dose of
Exactly.
reality.
Mhm.
That's what this is about now.
And I
So
hope-
we are literally almost completely out of time. It always gets so exciting towards the end, and then we
Yeah, why is that?
I would
So we
suggest
literally
to our listeners, if they don't read the book, please go on YouTube and find Robert.
Yes,
Compton.
absolutely,
Oh, good point.
They're excellent. Yeah.
absolutely.
All of
So
his
here's our closing quote for the episode, and this is also a quote from Dr. Jones. The end. This is from a different book, The End of White Christianity. The racial perception gap highlights one of the most powerful, but also least discussed divisions between Americans on the topic of race: the rift between the descendants of white Christian America and the rest of the country. Again, just let that kind of sink in. And as always, all of our conversations, our discussions always relate back to the Cairo question and why we do this in the first place, why this podcast exists in the first place. And that question is, will 3-year-old Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? And as always, the final question to members of our listening audience is this: what will you do to ensure that Cairo and his contemporaries do have the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which they were born? So with that, I close out our final episode for 2023, and I hope you have enjoyed every single moment, and we're looking forward to coming back together in 2024. Our theme for 2024 is community conversation. So thank you for joining us on Inflection Point Podcast here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time. And we're excited to see you in the new year as we immerse ourselves in that new theme. So enjoy this season of upcoming celebrations. Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, and Happy New Year. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and
and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.